Why is there so much talk about a new civil war in the USA? What's happening in Texas, and what's behind the crisis? Let's break it down. President Biden already had significant chances of going down in history as the least popular president in the country. But judging by recent events, he has no intention of slowing down. The reason, the crisis at the US-Mexico border, specifically in the state of Texas, many experts are now seriously discussing not just a civil war, but a situation that could potentially. What's going on there? Why is the situation so tense, and how could it possibly escalate into a civil war? Let's dig into it together. U.S. states. According to the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, all matters not explicitly addressed by the Constitution and not prohibited by it are reserved for the. This means that the lion's share of aspects of an ordinary citizen's life is primarily regulated by the laws of the state where they reside. More precisely, you are a citizen of your state first, and then the USA. Throughout much of the relatively short history of the United States, there has been a tense struggle between supporters of broad state powers where the federal government only handles defense and foreign policy and proponents of centralization. Much like in most countries around the world, this confrontation once led to the Civil War of 1861-1865, which was retrospectively tied to the issue of slavery. In reality, it was the accumulated dissatisfaction of several states with the federal policies and the desire to end it by seceding from the USA. As we know, the Federalists emerged victorious, but it only meant some restrictions on state powers. In other respects, state authorities remain quite independent, and even a governor's party affiliation is not always a defining factor in their migration policy. For a long time, the United States welcomed migrants from around the world with almost no restrictions until the mid-20th century when they started regulating the issue through laws, significantly limiting entry. Essentially, until recently, one could become a U.S. citizen through relatively few methods: being born on the territory, obtaining a green card full residency, but without political rights, by investing around $500,000 in the country's economy, winning a green card in the annual lottery, or getting a work visa, which could later be converted into a green card. In general, it was not an easy process. However, illegal migration persisted, primarily from South and Central American countries, primarily Mexico. U.S. federal laws allowed granting citizenship to a person who had lived in the U.S. for 10 years or more, even if thus migrants would enter the country, work unofficially to avoid detection, and then legalize their status. Although, on one hand, these individuals were breaking the law, on the other, they were essential to the economy as a source of cheap labor. Therefore, illegal migration was a common practice that authorities fought against on paper, but were not in a rush to completely eliminate until a certain point. With the onset of the Arab Spring in the 2010s, individuals from Muslim countries joined the familiar sources of illegal migration. They used established routes across the US-Mexico border for entry. The trafficking of migrants to the US had long turned into a mafia business, but in the 2010s, it became almost a separate industry with huge turnovers. The number of migrants per year was already in the hundreds of thousands, flooding cities and forming their own ghettos. As usual, newcomers from other countries and cultures did not hurry to adopt the lifestyle and thinking of the locals. Assimilate. In these ghettos, crime and drug trafficking increased, and the locals were less eager to learn English, as it became less necessary in densely populated Spanish-speaking areas. In general, there was an increased demand from citizens for swift and effective measures. No one liked the situation, and it was only getting worse. Nevertheless, during his term, Trump did not particularly achieve anything, and his project of a continuous wall on the border even provoked laughter from political opponents. The interruption of democratic rule by Republicans will not allow the consistent implementation for ideologues. This is an impossibility to carry out radical social transformation. And for corrupt officials, it's a loss of lucrative positions in the government through which someone's interests are being lobbied or money is being laundered. Migrants are reliable votes for Democrats with their socially oriented policies. Benefits, citizenship giveaways, voting requires it, lenient punishments for ethnic criminals, etc. Finally, migrants benefit from Democrats in power with their open immigration policy because it aligns with the migrants' plans to bring relatives and friends to the U.S. Republican tightening wouldn't allow them to achieve this. Sooner or later, this was bound to lead to escalation. Border control falls under the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency of the Department of Homeland Security. This is a federal agency, subject to the federal government, similar to the military. However, the state governor also has their own law enforcement agencies, primarily the police. But the most interesting part is the U.S. National Guard, which also reports to the governor. The National Guard has dual allegiance, both federal and state. In the former case, it serves as a reserve for the armed forces, with National Guardsmen forming composite units in Iraq and Afghanistan. In fact, up to half of the participants in these wars. In a major conflict, Army units can be deployed based on the National Guard. They serve as weekend soldiers, assembling on weekends and conducting field exercises once a year. The federal government, however, commands the National Guard as a full-fledged army during a state of emergency. And now, an unprecedented incident occurs. On January 24, the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, declared nothing less than a state of invasion, allowing him to expand his powers and use the National Guard. The military takes control of the Texas-Mexico border. In this effort, they are assisted by volunteer squads and the police. In these new conditions, Texans are acting much more decisively, ignoring Border Patrol officers and their attempts to regain control. They are also paying no attention to Washington's outcry. After a series of bold statements, Abbott made it clear that he does not plan to back down. Furthermore, 25 other states have expressed support by mobilizing their volunteers to assist. This presents an open conflict between state and federal authorities, with the federal government having very few leverage points, mostly due to the 10th Amendment. It cannot prohibit Abbott from using the National Guard in an emergency, and there are no restrictions on the president preventing him from doing so. The only step left for Biden is to declare martial law, after which the National Guard would come under his command and he could order them to leave the border. Otherwise, the laws from 1807 would come into play, and the actions of the Texas authorities would be classified as rebellion, with all the consequences. The stakes for such a turn of events are significant. In the run-up to the elections, this is a severe blow to the positions of both Biden and any other Democratic candidate. A sitting president who refuses to obey 25 states, HIA, half the country, does not appear as a promising leader for the next term. What are the political consequences? Talks about a division in the U.S. and the prospects of civil war started during Trump's term, during the BLM unrest in 2020, but that was a street-level story. Now, the division is within the very structure of power where each side has resources, legitimacy, and law enforcement. Despite separatist sentiments in Texas, its secession from the U.S. is unlikely, although only this state has the right to hold a referendum on leaving the Federation, a privilege not afforded to other states. This situation is so toxic for the country's economy and finances that it could lead to catastrophe. Congressmen, the majority of whom are Republicans, are now giving Democrats an ultimatum. Either regain control of the border under the Federal Border Patrol or allocate funds for Ukraine. Democrats are not in a position to. However, Republicans in Congress are unlikely to have direct leverage over the Republican Abbott, who is primarily accountable to the citizens of the state, not to party colleagues. What do you think about that? Share your opinion in the comments and be sure to watch the video linked to now.